Brothers and sisters, I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you today at Pune Temple. I first came to Singapore in 1984 for a brief visit, and I've been coming occasionally since then, but this is the first time I've given a talk here. I'm going to be talking to you today about a revolution. A peaceful Buddhist revolution. You know that Buddhism was born in India. Siddhartha was enlightened in India. He taught in India. His parinirvana took place in India. Buddhism flourished in India for many, many years. And from India it spread all over Asia. And everywhere it went, it had a very strong social and cultural impact, helping, contributing to the civilization wherever it was. The tragedy was that it died out in India. It effectively died out 700 years ago. In the 1951 census in India, there were just 130,000 Buddhists out of, I think, 375 million people. And those 130,000 were mainly from Tibetan communities on the northern borders of India. Now, today, there are millions and millions of people who call themselves Buddhist. And this is the story I'm going to tell you today. Yeah? Most of these people were called and treated as untouchables in the Indian caste system. And they found in Buddhism a means of liberation from that, a way forward, a way to live truly human lives. So today I'm going to talk about how they came to Buddhism. And tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the sort of work that I've been involved in over the last 36 years or so. How we work with people dharmically, what sort of teachings of the Buddha they find most useful. How they find Dhamma practice empowering them, how it helps them to be more socially active and creative. And so I'm going to go into that tomorrow, and tomorrow I'm also going to look at some of the lessons or inspirations that other Buddhists in Asia and also throughout the world, I come from UK, yeah, and I'm very inspired by the situation there. So some of the inspirations that other Buddhists can gain from the situation in India today. At the end, I hope there'll be time for questions if you have any. But if you want any clarification during the actual presentation, if you're not clear about what I've said or a point I'm making, please don't hesitate to stop me. Okay? Good. So Buddhism was born here. Many of you must have, or some of you must have been there. Yeah? At Buddha Gaya. And this is Sarnath, where the Buddha spent his first post-enlightenment rainy season retreat. And actually this is a bit wrong. But there, at the end of the rainy season, after his disciples were enlightened, and at the end of the rainy season in India, people traditionally, the monks would then leave and go wandering. He said, I've got it wrong, he said, Bahujana Hitaya, Bahujana Sukhaya. That means for the welfare of the many people, for the happiness of the many people. He said, go out for the welfare and happiness of the many people, the majority, as many people as you can, in a sense. Don't two of you go by the same path. In other words, reach as many people as possible. So, this teaching, given at the end of the first rainy season retreat, shows that compassion is at the very heart of the Buddha Dharma. This is Kritrakuta mountain, where the Buddha taught many great Mahayana sutras. And this is Shravasti. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a beautiful place. I spent 2 months there in 1978. According to the Pali Canon, the Buddha spent more time in Shravasti than any other place. I can't remember whether it was 23 or 22 or 24 rainy seasons. So he gave more teachings there than anywhere else. And one of my favourite teachings is the conversion of Angulimala. Anguli in Indian languages means finger, and mala means garland. So Angulimala, you must know the story, was I don't know how you describe him, but he was trying to get a garland of 1,000 fingers. And he saw the Buddha. He thought, there's my last one. But he didn't get there. He got enlightened instead. And the Parinirvana took place in India, at Kushinagar. This is the symbol today of the governor of India. But first of all, of King Ashoka, who H.G. Wells calls the greatest king in history. And that was because he tried to govern according to the principles of the Buddha Dharma. And he started sending the Buddhist teachings abroad. He sent his son and daughter Mahinda and Sanghamitta and others. He sent them to Sri Lanka, and he sent others to other parts of Asia. Buddhism spread all over India, and everywhere developing, again, what H.G. Wells calls the golden age of Indian history, a very positive Indian culture. Have you heard of the Ochenta Caves? Have you been there, any of you? Yeah. So the Ochenta Caves are sort of near Bombay, or not far, only, how far? I suppose about 10-hour drive. That's not very far in India. From Bombay, but you can fly, it's okay. But you've got these wonderful caves, and this is one of the earliest representations in India of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, Kuan Yin Pusa. Yeah? And see, the eyes are so beautiful. Yeah? Looking down in compassion, that's what Avalokiteshvara means. So Buddhism spread throughout Asia. I hope you'll forgive me for saying something about Chinese people when I'm not Chinese. But I've had a lot of contact with Chinese people in Taiwan and China and Singapore. Chinese people are very proud of their civilization, and rightly so. But they took Buddhism. And I understand from many of my Chinese friends, they took Buddhism because they felt it enhanced their civilization. Yeah? But everywhere Buddhism went, it contributed to peace. Yes, there is fighting between Buddhists in the name of religion, between Buddhists and others in the name of religion. I was a history teacher in the early 70s before I started doing this work. I didn't study Asian history, I studied European history. Can you hear me? Okay. And if you look at the history of Europe, it's just bloodshed, bloodshed, bloodshed in the name of religion. You don't see anything like that. You see little bits, exceptions, but nothing like that in Asia. Yeah? Education, art, beautiful art, beautiful, beautiful art. Generosity. King Ashoka set up hospitals. He set up facilities for travellers and so compassion. Chinese temples, I know, have always been a centre of compassionate action, of helping the disadvantaged. And on the whole, that's been the case pretty much wherever Buddhism has gone. So all over Asia. But it died out in India 700 years ago. These are some of the ruins of Nalanda University, which apparently had 15,000 monks at one time, and the great Xuanzang and other Chinese travellers stayed there. In the west, this is the Ochenta Caves. They were lost to Indian history. They were discovered actually by a British explorer 150 years ago or so, when he was out shooting tigers, I think. I can't remember. But these carvings are remarkable. South India, where Bodhidharma came from, and where Nagarjuna taught. Both very important names in Chinese Buddhist tradition. Actually, these Buddha images here, you can see the pointer here, can't you? These are from a Hindu temple in South India, and people thought that they were Hindu gods until recently. And recently their true identity has been realized. So you see this all over India. Old Buddhist remains, but forgotten about. In the East, Orissa, where I believe the Affadamsaka Sutra was given to, sorry, my Buddhist history is terrible, but a Chinese king was sent from Orissa to a Chinese king. The most incredible remains there, and it's completely outside the Buddhist pilgrimage circuit. If you want to go to India to visit the Buddhist holy places, probably very, very few people will tell you about Eastern India, Orissa. But today, these ruins, or some of them, are being worshipped again. These are the Bahji Caves near Pune. These caves came to life about 2,200 years ago. This was not a set-up picture. My friend who took the photo, this is a genuine act of devotion of someone who's become Buddhist recently. This is an early stupa. Buddhism was reborn at this place, Nagpur, in the centre of India, in 1956. 500,000 people over 2 days converted to Buddhism. And it was actually on the anniversary of King Ashoka's supposed conversion, when he gave up conquering people by the sword to conquer people or help people through the Dharma. And it was also during the 2500th anniversary of the Buddha's enlightenment. So this is a celebration of that conversion a few years ago. And the conversions were led by this man. Can you see? Yeah. Dr. Ambedkar. You may never have heard his name. Most people outside India haven't. But he was born an untouchable. And untouchables had enormous social disabilities. But he devoted his life to bringing about a society free of caste and untouchability. At that time, untouchables very few could get an education. He was the first untouchable in the whole of Western India to finish his school education. He was the first untouchable in India to go abroad to America to be educated to university. He was helped by very positive people. He came back to India, one of the highest educated people in India at that time, in the early 1920s. Because he was untouchable, he couldn't hold down a job. People wouldn't work with him. he devoted the rest of his life to trying to eradicate untouchability. Now, untouchables, and today they're commonly known as Dalits. In fact, the term untouchable is now illegal. But they are at the bottom of the caste system. This was done by one of our students, this picture. They make up 1/6 of India's population. That means 220 million people are Dalits or previously untouchables in India. What's the population of Singapore? Maybe 4 or 5 million people. Well, there's 220 million people in India. It's massive. Untouchables had to do, and still have to do, the most degrading work. Yeah? Cleaning the sewers, no protective clothing. In Pune, where I live, a few hours from Bombay, in 1 year, a few years ago, 247 municipal workers died, cleaning workers died during the year. They died either from disease from this work or from alcoholism because many of them drink so much to get rid of the horrors of the work. 247 in 1 year. Most of the prostitutes in India come from the Dalit or poor Nepalese Buddhist communities. Most are extremely poor. If you go to Bombay or Delhi, you see the most appalling living conditions. Yeah? Most of those will be Dalits, people who were in the untouchables. Traditionally, they were not allowed water from the common water sources. Dr. Ambedkar tried to drink this water at this tank in 1927. Yeah? The British government had said untouchables should be allowed to drink water from the common wells. So he wanted to establish his and his followers' rights. He and his followers were very badly beaten by local caste Hindus. Some were killed. Even today, many Dalits are beaten when they try and assert these sort of rights. And of course the children suffer the most. Yeah? Many have to work because their families are too poor or they don't understand the importance of education. If they go to school, what we find, because we do a lot of social work, which I'll tell you about tomorrow, if they do go to school, they get discouraged and tend to drop out early. And, the conditions many live in are absolutely appalling. And then thousands and thousands suffer from violence. And for no reason, often, than the fact that they are considered untouchable or Dalit. There was a survey done by an Indian newspaper 3 or 4 days ago, and it said that 1/4 of Indian people still admitted to still practicing untouchability, still admitted to discriminating on the basis of caste. Yeah? I went to India in 1977. I went there to live in 1978, in August 78. And at that time I was a monk with yellow robes. And I gave 3 lectures in Pune on the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And we had questions and answers after the talks. Now, just at that time, just a few hours away, near the Ochenta Caves, there's a town called Aurangabad. And the government had decided to rename the university there after Dr. Ambedkar. They wanted to get the votes of the Dalits, the followers of Dr. Ambedkar. Now, many local caste Hindus didn't like that, and they burned houses and raped Many, many people in all the villages around. It was horrific. At the end of one of my talks, someone asked a question. He said, I think it was a talk I gave on the Dharma. And then the Dharma, what are you trying to do? You're trying to cultivate skillful, kushala mental states. Yeah? This is what ethics is about. This is what meditation is about. Yeah? Cultivating highly skillful mental states and eradicating unskillful. So this man said to me, he said, when our houses are burned, when our mothers and sisters are raped, how can we develop these states? And I'd just come to India to work. I didn't know what to say. But nowadays I'm doing with my colleagues a lot of work to help these situations, but it happens all the time, even today. My wife is Indian. My wife is from this community. Once she was hit in front of me. So I have my own experience of it. So this was a situation that Dr. Ambedkar was born into in 1891. Only it was much, much worse then. As I said, he was one of the first untouchables to finish school and go to the Western University. He made an agreement with the Prince of Baroda, which was a princely state at that time. The Prince of Baroda funded his education abroad on condition that he come back and act as his minister's secretary for finance in his state. Dr. Ambedkar came back. No one would work with him in the office. He was secretary for finance, a top civil servant. Even the people who had to make the tea, move the files around, they would throw things at him because he was untouchable. They didn't want to go near him. No one would give him anywhere to live. In the end, he had to leave. But he was a brilliant man. He led a remarkable life. And he brought about many, many reforms for untouchables in the area of education, economics, law. He became the first law minister of independent India. And he was the man responsible for drafting, more than anyone else, he led the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, which is held up by many as a very special constitution today. And this is his statue outside the Indian Parliament, because of his contribution to constitutional change, development. But Dr. Ambedkar realized that constitutional change was not enough. He said at the time of preparing the Constitution, he said, the law only holds in rein the minority who are going to break it. Most people are governed by their moral sense, and that is for most people affected by their religious attitudes. Yeah? Most of us don't think all the time of the Constitution of Singapore. Yeah? We have our own sort of inner guidance. Yeah? What is right, what is wrong. So this was his point. So he wanted, he felt that what was required to overcome untouchability, legal change was not enough, although it was important. What was required was a deeper attitudinal change. Yeah? And he felt that was best brought about by Buddhism. In 1936, he summed up his ideal society. There should be social endosmosis, free mixing, free communication, not cut off, not stratified, not segregated, not divided. This is fraternity, which is only another name for democracy. Democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. It's a lovely definition of democracy and fraternity, isn't it? Yeah? So what he's saying there is that democracy and fraternity to work, they have to be taken, they have to be understood ethically. They have to be understood as ethical ideals. You can't have just legal democracy, legal fraternity. And he found that reforms would not help to bring this about as long as untouchables still thought of themselves as untouchables and others still treated them as such. See, if an untouchable thinks of himself as an untouchable, he thinks he can't change because he's been taught that it's a sin to change. As Buddhists, it's our duty to change. We have to change unskillful into skillful. We have to make the most of this life. But they had been told they must just sit out this life as untouchable. They could do nothing. So, as long as they thought of themselves as untouchable, there would be no impetus to change. What was needed, he said, was a complete change in the fundamental notions of life, a complete change in the values of life, a complete change in outlook and attitude. It means conversion, a new life. So this he said in the mid-30s. And then he realized that he had to find a religion which encouraged an attitude of equality. And although they were very, very socially deprived, he made the point, this battle is not a battle for material power or wealth. It's a battle for freedom, a battle for the reclamation of the human personality. So he looked at the different religions, and he had 3 criteria. Remember, he'd been educated in America, educated in England, educated in Germany. He very highly qualified. So he felt that the religion suitable for his people had to be in accordance with reason and science. It had to fit in with the modern world. It couldn't fight, the basic truths that we know today. It had to recognize the fundamental tenets of liberty, equality, fraternity, and it must not sanctify or ennoble poverty. It mustn't prevent people living basically healthy, substantial, material lives. And the only religion he knew that satisfied these criteria was Buddhism. Sorry about these long quotes. So he said, in the same booklet as the one that made those points, he said that Buddha taught as part of his religion social freedom, intellectual freedom, economic freedom, and political freedom. He taught equality not between man and man only, but between man and woman. It would be difficult to find a religious teacher to compare with Buddha, whose teachings embrace so many aspects of the social life of people, whose doctrines are so modern, and with main concern to give salvation to man in his life on earth, and not to promise in heaven after he is dead. I go to Taiwan quite often, and in Taiwan I've been lucky enough to meet many of the leading teachers there. Late Venerable Shenyang, the late Inshung, and others. And what I found is they've all been very influenced by the great Chinese monastic reform of Venerable Taishu, forgive my pronunciation, who I think died in just about 1947-48, I think. But I found Venerable Taishu's life and approach fascinating. His approach resonates so closely to that of Dr. Ambedkar's. He wanted, he had very strong confidence in Buddhism and felt it could communicate with people on the basis of values that we accept today. Now, in 1954, in an interview with the BBC, Dr. Ambedkar said something very, very interesting. He said, positively, my social philosophy may be said in 3 words: liberty, equality, fraternity. Let no one, however, say that I borrowed my philosophy from the French Revolution. I have not. I have derived them from the teachings of my master, the Buddha. I'll try and go into this a little bit tomorrow to show how these are Buddhist values, if we've got time. So he's not saying the Buddha actually said these words, liberty, equality, fraternity. What he's saying is these principles are implicit in the Buddhist teachings. Again, underlining the point that these principles are not merely political principles, they're ethical principles, even spiritual principles. And fraternity, for example. Fraternity, what does it mean? It's sort of not very politically correct these days, is it, fraternity? Because what about sisterhood? Yeah? But fraternity, if your brother or sister is ill, and you have good relations with them, which most of us do, we're very concerned. We'll do anything for them. Yeah? So fraternity is that principle applied to all human beings. But how do you develop that? In Buddhism, we have a practice. Yeah? The metta bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness, universal loving kindness. That's how to develop fraternity. Liberty, equality, tomorrow. So, in 1956, he attended a World Fellowship of Buddhist conference in Kathmandu. And he emphasized that the greatest thing the Buddha has done is to show the world that the reformation of the world could only take place on the basis of the reformation of the mind of man. And this, for a politician, is very, very strong. Social change will only come about on the basis of deeper ethical, spiritual change. Changing our minds, changing our hearts. So in October 1956, he converted to Buddhism with 500,000 people. And he said at that time, I have been released from hell. Yeah? He felt he was a new man leading a new life. And his followers celebrate this day as their day of freedom, freedom to be human. Now, I was in this train. This is a train going to the celebrations, the anniversary celebrations in Nagpur. This was in 1988. And I had a seat inside, not on top. Yeah? I was fortunate. Yeah? Huh? I don't think I'd want to sit on top. Yeah? Even when I was younger. But unfortunately, tragically, Ambedkar died just 6 weeks after his conversion. This is his conversion ceremony in Bombay, the biggest funeral ceremony India had seen until then. My teacher was an English Buddhist monk who was living in India at that time. And he was in Nagpur, where Ambedkar had converted to Buddhism on that day. And they had a condolence ceremony, and he said 200,000 people came. And speaker after speaker would come up, and they couldn't say anything because they just were in tears. So in the end, only my teacher could speak. But he had an incredible impact on people. He had shown them the way of freedom. These people who had been condemned in a sense to untouchability. Unfortunately, his vast movement was left without guidance. His political heirs divided the movement, tore it apart, as politicians often do. His new Buddhist followers were ignored by the Buddhist world. Great Buddhist teachers from Tibet, from Japan, from Sri Lanka, from Thailand, they go to the West, to America, to England. They didn't go to India, where even though there were millions of people who wanted to hear the Dharma, they didn't go. Very few people went. Most were extremely poor, even illiterate. So there were very, very few Dharma teachers amongst these millions of newly converted Buddhists. When I went there in 1978, I found this to be the case. So many places. And today it's still the case, all over India. Many people, they want to understand the Dharma, but they do not have a chance. But now this can you see where the pointer is pointing? This is the state of Maharashtra. This is Bombay or Mumbai here. This is the state of Maharashtra here. This is Nagpur, where Ambedkar converted to Buddhism. Yeah? So this was where his first followers were. Most of them were from this state. One particular untouchable caste, the Mahar caste. But in the recent 20 years or so, all over India, Untouchables, Dalits, have been inspired by Ambedkar to come into Buddhism. So in Maharashtra, in every single village and town, there are people wanting to hear the Buddha Dharma. Yeah? They want to know how it can change them as human beings and how it can help them to create a better world. This is in Bombay. This says, I don't know if any of you can read Devanagari, this says Buddha Vihar, yeah? Buddha temple. Yeah? They don't have much money, but they've got their little temple. And these people are at a Buddhist program at a vihara of ours, a temple of ours in Pune. So they want to hear the Dharma, starving to hear the Dharma. And as I said, now people all over India are wanting to become Buddhist, wanting to understand how the Dharma can change them. This is a program a few years ago, a conversion ceremony. Some people estimate the figure of Buddhists at over 45 million people today. And yet, probably, most of the people who come from the Untouchable community, that's 220 million people, most of them would be open to the Dharma if they had people teaching that in a meaningful way. So, this is really all I've got to say today, and I've tried very briefly to give you an idea of how Buddhism is returning to India. And tomorrow I shall look at some of Dr. Ambedkar's most significant Buddhist teachings, how we work with them, yeah? And how we find the Dharma empowering, yeah? How it helps to change us, and how it helps us to be more effective socially, the sort of social work we're doing, on the basis of Dharma practice. And then I want to conclude tomorrow with some points of significance for the Buddhist world in general. I'll try and show how these young people, whose parents were cruelly treated as untouchables, have a future in Buddhism, and in turn, how they can help to give India and Asia a better future. So, that's part one finished.